Lastly, as now we're in our world and we're thinking about how do we respond to what God is saying in the passage, we want to think through aims, authors, intended messages for me and my community. And so, what are the divine authors' intended messages for me and my community to know, feel, be, and do? So, think in terms of what is the passage calling me or us to know and believe? What is the passage calling me or us to feel? What is the passage calling me or us to do? And then, what are the barriers to us or me rightly living out this passage? There's always going to be barriers. So, what are those barriers? And what grace then do I need? The grace of His Spirit, the grace of community, um, the grace of the Word. There's all kinds of graces that He provides for us. What kind of grace do I need to overcome these barriers? So let's look at Luke 7. So an aim, again, we came up with aims for the original audience back when we were in the world of the text. Now we want to think through aims for me and my community. So God, you are calling me to believe that you truly have and will continue to greatly forgive me. You're calling me to believe that instead of trying to, in some subtle ways, earning my favor with you. God, you're calling me to feel disgust for my self-righteousness. Let me hate the Simon in me that refuses to see his need and therefore loves little. God, you're calling me to unreservedly worship you out of a deep love for your grace and forgiveness. God, you're inviting me into a life of radical love for you in response to your radical grace for me. Again, we think of this woman, and it's all because of response. It's a response of what Christ has done that she loves. She loves because she's been forgiven much. In the same way, you're inviting me, God, into a life of radical love for you in response to your radical grace for me. And God, I need you so desperately to remind me of how deep my sin is and to be reminded of your ever deeper grace. So I think of the barrier for me in this is just this hard-hearted forgetfulness of my own deep sin. And so I actually need God. I'm calling out to Him to desperately remind me of how deep my sin is, to remind me of His ever deeper grace. Now, as we think of Genesis 21, God, you're calling me to believe that you truly are the God who hears me in my desperation. God, in my desperation, I feel anxious and out of control, but you are calling me to find peace in your ever-sustaining living water. God, when faced with feeling like you don't hear or care, you're calling me to pray and to truly trust in your presence and ultimate provision. So like a to-do here is that He's calling me to pray more. One of the areas in my life that I need the most help. God, the greatest barrier, here's the barrier, to coming to you in prayer and trusting you in my wilderness is my pride. Thinking that I can and will handle the situation myself. And so God, I need the grace of community, of a community of believers who will speak into my pride when they see me go into self-preservation mode. So I need people around me, the grace of people, the grace of community, to be able to speak into that and call it what it is. And then in Ephesians, God, you're calling me to cease striving, to prove myself and to rest in your grace. God, you're inviting me to sit with you where there is endless and lavish kindness. And God, you're calling my church community to live out the good works of mercy toward those who are dead in their sins. So this mercy just doesn't come to me only, or it doesn't even just stop with me and my community. It's to flow through us through the good works that God has called us to live in, to be able to show the very same kind of love, mercy, and grace that God has shown to me, to show that to my community. To those, to not my church community, but to those that live outside of the faith. So that is the entirety of going from our world to, with our lenses that we wear, into the biblical world, to read the text in first trying to discover the context of the historical literary context, or the cultural context, the literary context, and the redemptive context. And we think through the text, how it was written in its genre, what was being said, making observations, what was the human author emphasizing in terms of structure of the passage, what was the theology of the passage. And then we check our work as it relates, as we dive into some commentaries. And then what we do is we come out of that with our aims, the author's intended messages for the original audience. This is what the author wanted them to believe, be, do, feel. And then we think through how this all relates to us. So we think through discontinuities, those things that are different, that just don't carry over to us today. We think through continuities, those things that do come over. All those things we think in terms of culture. We think in terms of God. We think in terms of people. We think in terms of redemption. We think in terms of ethics. And once we think in terms of the discontinuities and continuities, then we think about, how does this relate to Christ? He's the centerpiece of the entire Bible. And we think in terms of, how does this ultimately find its fulfillment? How does this point to Christ? And once we do that, then we think about, how now does this relate to us? Where do I find myself? In what context do I find myself? How does this text now speak to me as it relates to my brokenness, as it relates to my fallenness, as it relates to redemption, as it relates to what God is calling me to? And then I put those down. Almost, you could turn those aims into journal entries then. The aims, the author's intended messages now for me. What is God saying now for me? And what he's calling me to believe, me to do, me to feel. So I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and if they've given you a little bit more tracks to run on in how you read and study the scriptures for life change.